Hi, this is Brian with Prophetless Media and Post, and today we're going to talk about this surface tracker in DaVinci Resolve Fusion. This will be a pretty long tutorial, so I'll put some timestamps below so you can skip around if you want. I will be taking time to go over most of the tools inside the surface tracker, so you'll have an understanding of how to use the tools inside the surface tracker for your own projects. If you'd like to follow along, I'll also put some links below in the description so you can download the clips we are using in this video. The effect we're going to do in this video is similar to the newspaper effect you may have seen in the Harry Potter movies and other movies. We're going to add an animated clip to the newspaper so it moves with the newspaper. I chose this clip in particular because although it looks easy, I ran into a few issues with tracking, so I think it's a good example to use to show how you can use the surface tracker when the defaults don't work. So let's just jump into Fusion. And let's add in a surface tracker and let's connect that up and then put that up into the main window. As soon as we add the surface tracker, the first thing that's highlighted is bounds. Let's just go over the surface tracker basics right now. So we have our bounds, then we have our mesh, and this is where it'll mesh the bounds. Then we can track our mesh, and then we can composite at the end. So inside the bounds, this is where we're going to put the boundary to the image that we're going to track. We could do that by just clicking inside, and you can see we start to add points. And as we add points, it'll start to make a boundary. Everywhere we click, we'll add another point. If we want, we can option click on the point and it'll delete it. For this example, we want to track this insert right here. And so we're going to do this similar to like you would want to do roto. So you want it to be pretty tight to the area that you want to track. To help with this, you can add more contrast to the image, and that'll help with the tracking and also help with referencing where points are on the image. So I'm going to use a color corrector, but you could use any other node you want to do this. And I'm just going to drop that in there and add a little bit more contrast to make everything pop out. And I want to add a few more points on the edge. And I want to add these points to areas that have high contrast. So I can visualize as it's tracking to see if it's correct. And if I have to do any adjustments manually, it'll be easy to locate the points. So I think that looks pretty good. Those are some pretty easy points to reference. So down under here, let's take a look under click to add points. So we added our bound, and that's bound 1. So if we click on here, we can see bound 1. We also have an option here to add more bounds. So if we wanted to also add this part of the article into it, we could add a separate shape for that. So you can add quite a few different ones if you wanted to. Then beside that, we have a hole. And for example, here we have this finger that comes across. And if I click on add hole, I can add this shape, something like that. And that's going to put a hole in the mesh when it goes over into mesh. And I'll just show you that real quick. So if I go over to mesh, you can see right here, it cut a hole where that mask was. But for this example, I don't want to do that. I don't think we're going to need to do that. So I'm going to just delete, making sure that hole 1 is inside the boundary, hit delete. And that'll delete that. And I think for this example, the finger doesn't really move throughout the clip. It stays right there on the newspaper. If I go through, you can see that the finger stays in the same spot. So I don't think that's going to cause a problem. So I'm not going to do the hole there. Once we're done with our bounds, we can head over into the next room, which is the mesh room. And we have a few options here. So we have the regenerate mesh when you need to regenerate it. Underneath that, we have a bunch of options here. By default, it's at automatic, which is going to try to find the best points to track. You also have uniform grid, and if we turn that on, you can see we have a grid of points. And you can change those by using the horizontal and vertical spacing. And you can see how that works. But we're going to keep it at automatic. Underneath that, we have the point number limit. So this is how many points are going to be added. So if we want a really dense mesh, we can bring it all the way up. Or if we want fewer, you can bring it down. Minimum point spacing is going to get the spacing to be more even. So if I go up, you can see how it evens it out. If we come down, it'll cluster them more. So if I go way up like this, you can see it's more clustered. If I come out like this, it's going to spread it out more evenly. So for this example, I think I'm going to tone this down a little bit. I don't think I need that many. And then I'm going to change the spacing to kind of spread them out a little bit. So something like that. Now, if I wanted to, I can come in here and similar to what we did with the bounds, you can option click and you can delete points, or you can just click and you'll add points and it'll remesh it. Now, once you're inside the mesh, you can't delete the bounds. You'd have to go back to bounds and delete them if you wanted to change that. So I think I'm pretty happy with that. I think that'll be good enough for what we need to do. So let's head over to the track tab. We've got a bunch of options here at the top. You got to go to start, go to end. That's just moving the playhead to the beginning and end. Then you have all your tracking options right here. This will track all the way to the beginning. This will track to the end. This will track both ways. And then we can go one frame at a time, either forward or backwards. And then you can pause or stop the track here. Underneath that, we have a bunch of options to remove the keyframe. So if things are great all the way down here, but you want to delete the keyframes at the beginning and change the settings, you can use this to delete everything beforehand, delete everything after, delete the keyframe that you're on, and then track from the last known match. Underneath that, we have some interactions, show, hide on drag, and hide. So we can hide the grid, show it, or hide on drag, which means as soon as we click on here, it'll hide it. Then at the bottom, we have the tracking behavior, which the motion range, you can use that if your motion is a little bit faster. If this is useful, it will search further for the points. And this is actually a good case example because when we come down like this, you can see the paper, right there, bounces. So there's a pretty quick movement there. So changing this might be helpful. And then below that, we have the mesh rigidity. It is pretty self-explanatory. The higher we go up, the more stiff the mesh is. The lower, it's more cloth-like. So depending on what surface you're trying to track, you can change these. And then at the very bottom, we have the quality, which is faster and better. These are at the expense of processing for sure. Better does what it says it's going to do. It is better, but it will take more processing time. So it really depends on your needs. So I'm going to leave these things at the default, and let's just see. I'm just going to adjust these a little bit, make sure that they're all where they need to be. Okay, that looks pretty good. We're on one frame 144, and I'm going to just hit the track forward and backwards and just see what we get from these settings. Okay, great. So that's done. I can tell we're going to have a little problem here because that's slid off. Let's zoom out a little bit more. As we go through, okay, we've got another problem here. It slid off here on that bounce. But overall, the track is decent. It's just a couple, basically these two corners seem to not be doing great. Now we have a couple options here. I'll just go over this real quick. Before we get into changing these behaviors, I wanted to point out some manual options. One thing we could do, there's probably a whole bunch of different approaches, but as we come down here, so let's look at this point here, you can see it's starting to slip off there. There's a couple of ways we could go about this. We know where that corner is. We can just come in here and move it, and then we can either use the track forward. Okay, and now it seems to be sticking. And if you get it, sometimes it's just a matter of getting it back on track for a frame, and then it'll track all the way to the end. And if that's the case for like this, we could just hit the track to end from here because we already got it looking pretty good there. And then let's see if it did it. Okay, so it didn't work there. Let's see. We got like that's looking pretty good, and then it's starting to slide again. Another way we could do this is just doing it manually and using the arrow keys. You can go left and right arrow keys to go forward and backwards a frame. And you can actually do this pretty quick. You can just kind of come in here and left arrow, click, left arrow, click. And you could manually do it, kind of like roto. And you can adjust it to whatever you need. And that's going to keep those keyframes, see? And you can come back and just adjust it. So that's also another way you can adjust it. Obviously, you can spend more time doing it. But I just wanted to show you how you might be able to work through some really tricky spots. So that's another way you could do it, and that'll keyframe each frame. You can also, another thing I wanted to point out is that these keyframes, when they're missing, they interpolate. So for example, if you just had one glitch on one frame, say that point went flying out of there, but it was fine everywhere else, you could come to that frame, come over here, delete the keyframe, and it'll interpolate between the two keyframes. Okay, so I just wanted to show you a few different ways you could do it manually if you're not getting the results you want. So let's go back to frame 144, and let's try to use this tracking behavior and see if we can get a better result. Everything's looking pretty good as far as lined up on that frame. And I'm going to bump up this motion range to something like, let's go 0.6. And then I'm also going to change the rigidity. I'm going to make it more flexible. See if that helps with that big bump right there. And the other thing I can do is change this to better. Now, this is going to make it take a lot longer than the first run, but if it gets us a good result and we don't have to do it by hand, then hey, that works. So let's set that and let's see how that does. And I'll be back in a second. Okay. All right, that took a couple minutes. Let's see what we got here. Okay, that took care of that edge there. What about this bounce? Okay, that looks good. Okay, so that it was a little bit that took a little bit longer, but I think we're getting a good enough result here. Yeah, I mean it could be a little bit, well, let's see what happens here at the end. I mean, that's not bad. We might need to do some further adjustments here, but let's see what happens when we put the whole thing together. We might be able to get away with that. Okay, but overall, I think that looks pretty good. Yeah, that's gotten all the motion in. Okay, so now we're ready to take a look at the compositing. So let's go over to results. And I just want to go over all these options real quick. Let's open all these up. So by default, we're going to get the warp input 2 onto 1. And that's going to take whatever we put in here, and we can do the compositing right inside the surface tracker. We won't need a merge node or anything like that. Option 2 is, let's bring in the clip. So here's the clip. Let's just drop that in. Okay, awesome. Well, we crashed. Anyway, so this is the clip of this biker, and the link is down below if you want to download it. It was a slow motion clip, so I added a time speed to speed it up twice as fast, and then I delayed it 55 frames just so that it's framed up this way at the beginning. I did a quick color correct just to blend it in a little bit nicer with the newspaper. Definitely could use a little bit more work, but that's a basic gist. So let's look at the surface tracker. And let's go over the operations real quick. We have a bunch of different options here. So the default is warp input 2 onto 1, which means you can do the compositing right in here. This is input 2, our media 2 coming in. And they'll just do the compositing right inside. And you have at the very bottom, you have all the same compositing types that you would have in the merge node. So you can change it to add, subtract, whatever you need to do. And you can actually do it right inside here if you wanted to. The next option is the one I usually use, which is warp input to onto blank. So this will just be the warped image just added in. And then we have warp input one's alpha. If we do that, that's just going to grab the alpha from whatever's in the input and warp that. And then we have create mesh alpha mask, which looks the same, but it's actually pulling this is the actual tracking mesh and the alpha for that tracking mesh, where this input here could be some other image. Could be like an alpha for a logo or text or something like that. Below that, we have the stabilize warp input 1, which is going to, as you would expect, it will stabilize the image based on its reference frame. So it's 144. So you can see that it's stabilizing the image on that frame. The way you would use this is similar to if you're familiar with using the planar tracker. This is about the same thing. You would stabilize your clip, and then you would copy this surface node. And after you're done doing whatever work, if you're going to do like paint work, you would copy this clip and then change it to rewarp, and it would warp the image back over. So similar to that, but that's beyond this tutorial. Underneath that, we have the overlay alpha source, which is each frame, and that's what you'll use typically when you're adding in something like a sequence. But if you wanted to, you could add a still frame or use another source and only use a certain frame. So this is going to grab either the first frame or a reference frame. And this would be really useful if, for example, so in this example, what I did was I just took the media in and then added it right into the surface tracker. So now we're just using our original clip. And with that set up, if we come over to overlay alpha source, we could just use a still frame from this other source. And we can use whatever we want. There's multiple different ways we could do this. If I set it to reference frame, it's going to be this reference frame. If I use first frame, you can see that inside here is now based off of a still of the first frame. And this would be good for, say you wanted to, we had a blemish somewhere where you just wanted, we can take a clean part of the image and rewarp it back on. Great for something like a light switch. If there was like a light switch here and we track that, then we could use this and then just slide it over and it'll mesh back in. So that's just a quick example of how you can use this. There's a lot of ways that you could use this, but I just wanted to show you how that works. Okay, so we're back at each frame. Underneath that, we have expand and contract and softness, and this is for the edge of what we're putting in. So if I go expand, you can see I expands the circle and brings it in, or makes it softer. You can soften the edges, and so that's how that works. Below that, we have the overlay placement. So if we went to go to reference, and then when we go to reference, we're going to have this setup, which is the interactive canvas by default. You have a few different options here, depending on what you want to do. We have if we go under position, we have sliders. Here you can use the sliders to position your clip wherever you want, or zoom, all this stuff here. We also have interactive pins. It works similar to some of the meshing and bounds, where if I option click on the point, it'll make it disappear, and then we can add a point just by clicking. So we could do we could do a corner pin like this and just option click that one out. And then we have 4 corners that we can use. Or we can use the interactive canvas, which I like. The interactive canvas works pretty good. And that way that works, as you can see, is I'm grabbing these corners to bring the corner. This can bring the edge. I grab in the center to grab the whole thing and position it wherever you want. So say something like that. Okay, underneath that we have our hide on drag and hide. So you can hide the controls, hide on drag. So as soon as I click, you can see that you can move it around without any obstruction. And then at the bottom we have our compositing, which we went over earlier. Okay, So now that we have that all set up, now that we've gone through all of that, let's set this to warp onto blank. And then we're going to merge this back over the top. And then put our merge up in the window, and we can see our composite. Okay, so let's see how we're doing here. Okay, that looks pretty good. Overall, that looks pretty good. One thing I noticed right off is that right here you can see there's some motion blur. So we're going to need to add in some motion blur. So let's go into the surface tracker. And if we go over to settings, we can add our motion blur here. So let's turn on motion blur. That's a little too wild. And let's bring up the quality to like 8. And we're going to try to blend it in and make it sort of look like that. Let me see. That's a good frame to kind of judge on. I'll just play with some of these. I don't know what, bring the shutter angle down maybe. Closer to 90. Sample spread. Maybe bring that up. How does that look? Okay, that looks pretty good. I think we can mess around with that if you want to get it a little bit nicer, but overall I think that, yeah, that looks not bad. Now I'm seeing another issue. Since we're doing the motion blur, if we take a look at the surface tracker, you can see that that edge is starting to bleed a bit. So we're starting to see that image from underneath. So we might have to do something to fix that. We're also going to see as we come down here, it's a little too sharp. So the first thing I'm going to do, let's add a little bit of blur. Yeah, that looks pretty good. So one of the things that we can do, well, we already have the surface tracker. So one thing we could do is sort of like a clean plate. We can add an image underneath this. So let's make ourselves a little bit of room and do that. Copy that surface tracker and then bring it in here. I'm going to merge this. Oops, I don't want that. And I'm just going to use a background. And we want that to go in here. And I need something to fill in here. I can just grab a background to do this. So this background here, you could rename this if you want, but I think this is short enough. I'm not going to worry about it. So in this surface tracker, and let's just select the background. And let's grab the picker and let's go in here and see if we can get a color that's pretty close to the newspaper, something like that. If you hold down Command and drag, you can get more sample size. You can see you can get a bigger box. So something like that maybe. And this one also has the motion blur on it, so it might help. Let's see what that did. I'm going to turn that off, and then I'm looking at that surface. I'm looking at this surface tracker. And then let's expand this out a little bit. Whoop, not that much. Now let's see what the difference is here. If I take this merge, you can turn it, you can see the big difference. It's just taking away that edge a little bit where the original image from below is bleeding through. It still looks like it's something going on there. Okay, so let's see if that works. So just kind of blending it in a little bit and see if that works. Okay. I think that looks pretty nice. I think I could spend a little bit more time on getting the color of this maybe a little bit better. Maybe I'm messing around with the motion blur. But overall, I think that looks pretty good. Yeah. It looks nice. Okay, so that's the basics of the surface tracker and a few different ways you can adjust your settings if you're not getting the results you need. I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial, and I'll see you in the next video.